All right, the third big factor. So global trade's breaking down because the Americans have lost interest. Demographics are inverting everywhere in the developed world with the exception of the US. The third piece is the shale revolution. There are a number of technologies that are percolating through the shale patch. I'm going to talk about two of them very briefly. The first is seismic. Now, seismic is not new. It's been around since the late 1970s. The idea is you use a sound truck to sound waves down into the ground. They bounce around. You pick up the reverberations with microphones on the surface. You get a hazy slice of data, kind of like these, that you use to kind of inform your guesses as to where you're going to drill. That's old seismic. New seismic is you put a string of microphones down into a well and you listen to the microsounds within the formation. And it's so sensitive that as you're drilling, those sounds map out the formation in real time. And you know exactly where every molecule of petroleum is. And the results are just stupefying. Come on, people. The United States shale patch has not drilled a dry well in 3 years. They have not drilled a low productivity well in 2 years. We have seen output in the shale patch in the last 3 years increased by a factor of 15 per well, just because of this. The other one, improvements in drilling technology. At the dawn of the shale revolution, you'd go down a vertical mile and then over 600 feet. We then figured out how to extend those laterals by a factor of 10. So you get about 2 kilometers of contact for every well drilled. Now, we're doing pad drilling, multiple straws down with the same surface infrastructure. Drops the cost per well. The new thing, multilateral drilling. One shaft goes down, drills a lateral, comes back, another and another and another and another. You come back up to the next layer and you do it all over again and again and again. We now have wells with an excess of 80 miles of horizontal contact from one point on the surface. Now, in any area, this is going to be revolutionary. Places like the Eagleford have 2, 3, 4 layers. Places like the Bakken have 2 or 5. The Permian, in some places, has 20. You put these technologies together and it changes the cost structure. The wider the column, the more oil that comes out of the play. So this is OPEC over here. The taller the column, the more the cost for producing the oil in the first place. And that's everything from exploration on the front end to taxes on the back end. This is shale as of 5 years ago. Very expensive, most expensive crude in the world, didn't kick out a lot. But with these new technologies being combined into a best practices suite, here's where we are this year. The break-even price right now is about $43 a barrel. And as these technologies mature, we are looking at that break-even price dropping below $25 a barrel by the end of 2019. Canada and the United States as a unit became net oil exporters 2 weeks ago. The Americans are there. The last thing that tied them into the global system just broke. So it changes the way the United States views the world.
What is the advantage of keeping the costs down?
Well, profit, primarily. I hate to oversimplify, but really that's what it comes down to. Anytime that you can drop your costs and increase your profit, you do it. And we're now in a position where there's over 100 American companies that have the suite of necessary tech to do this. Every time you push it down in a globalized system, you obviously depress the overall global price. What I'm going to argue is that we're not going to be in a globalized system for much longer, and you'll have the Americans with one price structure and everybody else with another, but we'll get to that in a minute. So this is how the United States saw the world back in 1985 at the height of the Cold War. The dark blue, those are the countries that the United States was willing to fling nukes to defend. The medium blue, those are the core Bretton Woods allies. Those are the partners in the game. The orange, those are the other guys. Americans don't like to talk about them. And the light blue, that's the field of competition. Everything mattered, everything was in play. Now change oil dependence. Shift the way the US views trade. Change the way the Americans think about the alliance structure. And this is where we're about to be. The backyard's still there. In fact, it's even expanded a little bit. But for the most part, the United States just doesn't care what happens to the rest of the world. Order will give way to disorder, because without a global structure, everything that we understand about how the world works falls apart. And very few countries have the capacity to impose some sort of alignment in their own neighborhood, much less globally. Yes, please.
Why did you drop off Germany?
Germany without the European Union is a country that actually has to look out for its own economic and physical well-being, which means, among other things, they need to rearm. Every time that Germany has ever had an army, it has ended badly for someone. Now, just because a country is orange on this map doesn't mean it's aggressive towards the United States, just that it's going to try to redefine its own region. Doesn't mean those things. Post-Cold War, there was a 60% drop in the Russian birth rate, which means that the Russian army in 2022 will be less than half the size that it was last year. If the Russians are going to attempt to use military tactics to shape their world, this is their last chance. They have to do it now. And so they are. But you have to look at the world through a Russian lens. The deep red is Russian majority ethnic population. The other colors don't mean non-populated, just not Russian. The problem the Russians have is this western periphery is roughly 2,000 miles long, and it makes Kansas look flat. I'm sorry, it makes Kansas look hilly. That backwards. They cannot defend that territory with the army they have, much less with the army of the future. So their thinking is, if they can forward position their rapidly shrinking military into these 5 arcs, 2,000 miles of Great Wide Open shrinks down to about 450 miles of constrained access. That they can do. All they have to do is conquer all or part of 11 different countries. Say what you will about the Russians, they've never had a problem thinking big. Here's the problem for the rest of the world. That's the Russian oil export network. That's 7 million barrels per day of crude. That's 12 BCF of natural gas. All of it going through the conflict zones. Take that offline even briefly, and you're talking about a decade of a global energy-induced depression. That's War I. War II is in the Persian Gulf. Now, the reason that the Persian Gulf has been so calm for the last 40 years, just marinate in that statement for a moment, is Bretton Woods. The United States has kept a carrier battle group in the Gulf at all times to keep the local powers separated and to make sure that the oil can flow out. The oil powers the trade era. Trade gives the United States its alliance. The alliance gives the Americans their security. But the Americans now define their security differently. They're no longer using the alliance. They've never used the trade in the first place, and now because of shale, they don't even need the oil. Every link in the chain of logic that keeps the United States involved has broken. That leaves it up to the locals to figure out who's in charge. Israel is basically going to have a popcorn shortage because they're just watching the whole world go apart and they're just fine. The Saudis and the Iranians are the two that matter. They're the men in the middle. They're the ones that have the power. They're the ones who want to be in charge. They've got some very specific ideas of how this should go down. But they are two countries that are opposed ethnically, demographically, religiously, politically, strategically, and because of shale, economically. They're now sending exactly the same product along exactly the same routes to exactly the same customers. This is going to end in a fight. In fact, if you look at things like Yemen and Syria, that's just the opening phases of their conflict. It's going to get a whole lot worse. Now, I could give a presentation for 2 hours just on this, but everyone in the United States is really tired of the Middle East, so let me just kind of sum it up this way. Think of it like the fight between Texas A&M and UT, just with more guns. But people actually lose. And like all of the world's truly great rivalries, eventually fans end up in the wrong bar. So down here at Kyle Field, you have the Ghawar Superfield, which is the world's largest oil producing asset. Right next to it is the Abqaiq oil Abqaiq, the world's largest oil processing facility. And just downstream from there, you've got the Ras Tanura Superport, which is the world's largest oil loading facility. The College Station area is home to 2.5 million religious Shia in Sunni Saudi Arabia. Now up here at UT Tower, in the Austin area, you've got 80% of Iran's oil and natural gas production. Living in the greater Austin area, you have 3 million ethnic Arabs in Persian Iran. Saudi intelligence and Iranian intelligence are not sparing the horses in attempts to spawn revolutions in these two areas, working from the very accurate assessment that if you shut off the oil income, you almost certainly kill the country. Just those two arrows, that's 11 million barrels per day of crude. The country's caught in the crossfire, we're now up to 20. And if you have a shortage anywhere in the world, Brazil, Canada, Persian Gulf, the entirety of the shortage has to be sucked up by Northeast Asia. The red bars on the right are net oil exports. The green bars on the left, net oil imports. The green bars on the left are net oil exports. You'll notice how conveniently far apart they are. It's a 7,500-mile sail from the head of the Persian Gulf to Tokyo Bay. So any shortages anywhere in the world, and everyone else can get a crack at Persian Gulf oil before it gets to Northeast Asia. So the Northeast Asians have to suck up the entirety of the shortage. So if you are Japan or Korea or Taiwan or China, your only option is to take your Navy, sail around East Asia to the Persian Gulf, pick sides in a centuries-old blood feud, load up the crude yourself, convoy it home, and hope to God that no one tries to take it from you. Now, if this were anywhere else in the world, I'd be worried. But this is Northeast Asia. And if there's anything we know about the Koreans, the Chinese, the Taiwanese, and the Japanese, it's that they've got a centuries-old history of brotherly love and cooperation, and nothing could possibly go wrong. But humor me. What happens the first time that a tanker is shot at, hijacked, sunk? Because without oil, the lights go out, these countries stop. We get shooting wars in these three zones, where maritime transport isn't a casualty, it's a target. This is 3/4 of global agricultural shipments. This is 3/4 of global manufacturing supply chain steps. This is 80% of global maritime oil shipments. The oil markets will explode. And with the speed of a tweet, the United States will reenact the oil export ban. And with nowhere else to go, Anglo-American crude will have a ceiling on its price of about $70 a barrel, because production decisions are made by small and medium-sized countries that ship at relatively short-haul distances, with production decisions based on financials and profit motive into a system that can refine all the crude it produces. And then you've got the global system, where production is decided by state-owned companies who are using strategic and political goals to drive their decision-making, where the production times to bring stuff online isn't the month or two that it is in shale, but a decade or two for the big projects in the rest of the world, where the transport links go thousands of miles over open seas that no one controls through war zones. And you're going to have a functional floor of $150 a barrel, with probably a $50 a barrel surcharge for Northeast Asia. Complete market bifurcation. We're going back to the world before 1939.
So the role of our leaders then is to create a lot of instability in these areas, so that our shale, we're so efficient, our shale, our price is so cheap. Well, let's create instability so that we can.
There's an argument to be made that that would make good corporate sense, but I'm pretty sure the world's going to take care of that without any meddling from the United States. It's like you remove the security blanket that has been provided since 1945. No one is capable of replacing it. It falls apart pretty quickly because everybody's going to have to look out for their own interests, and there's not enough for everyone.
Isn't that the music for Venezuela? Countries with oil outside of the United States?
If you are in the Western Hemisphere and you're broadly immune to the chaos over here, the potential for oil income increases is huge, but you still have to bring it online. And so for places like Mexico and Venezuela, the production has sagged so much for so long in such a hostile environment for investment, I don't think you're going to have to do much liberalization to spawn interest in this scenario, but it's going to take time. The offshore fields in the Gulf of Mexico, you're talking a minimum of 8 years for first oil there. So this is going to run for several years before any hope of recovery in global output can happen. Yes?
This is predicated on China not stepping into the void and providing the American police state, or policing.
For that to work, the Chinese have to be willing to be the market of first and last resort, and they're exporters.
Well, given that they are oil dependent, it behooves them to build a regional navy.
Oh, we'll get to that in just a second.
Okay.
In fact, we'll get to it right now.
All right.
All right, this is the Chinese geography. Now, the amount of arable land in China is only slightly larger than the amount of arable land in Mexico. It's about 15% of the arable land in the United States, yet they've got 4 times the population. The concentration of it, of course, here is in the North China Plain. The problem with the North China Plain is that there's no internal barriers. So when they had all of their wars going back to 1000 BC, there was nothing you could hunker behind to defend yourself. It was just a wide open plain. You guys have all played Risk, right? You know how no one wants to start in East Asia because they can come at you from every direction? That's the North China Plain. It took 3,000 years of war and ethnic cleansing for it to consolidate into a single ethno-political group that we now know as the Han Chinese. So northern China is run by the militarists, the politicos, the nationalists. It's different in central China. Here you've got the Yangtze, one of the world's great rivers, roughly 2,000 miles long. But it's small, it's a really narrow corridor. They're never going to have political power, even if they are the mercantilists and the industrialists. So up north is the power center. This is the economic engine that has to often defer to the power center. And then down south it gets really different. This green zone is the tropics. And the same thing happens to a northern Chinaman who goes into southern China as an American who goes into the Yucatan. He gets bit by strange bugs, they start bleeding strange colors, and they die horribly. It's a disease belt, and there's no resistance for the northerners, just the southerners. They also have all the good ports. So it's isolated, and it interacts with the rest of the world. In fact, they've gotten over half of their food from the rest of the world now for 12 centuries. So northern nationalists, central economists, southern secessionists. How do you get all these groups to work together? Well, there's 2 things you can do. First, you beat the crap out of anyone who causes a problem. China can only exist as a national security state because they have to keep everybody on the same page. Second, you bribe the hell out of everybody. You take all of the citizens' deposits, you force them into 4 state banks. Those state banks divvy out loans not based on profitability or business plans, but on employment goals. There are more people doing absolutely nothing in China than the rest of the world put together, but they're on payroll. Because if you have a paycheck, you don't get together in large groups and go on long walks together. Pull up your own nose, that's a bad idea, that's how they got their jobs. Now back in 2007, this was the height of American subprime. And in 2007, total Chinese lending surpassed total American lending. And then, in the next 18 months, because of the financial crisis, it tripled. Because when people stopped buying Chinese crap, the Chinese couldn't downsize. They just kept paying people to build stuff that nobody wanted because they couldn't deal with the political shock of mass employment. Now, it looks like they got it under control, but no, not really. They found new ways to force capital through the system. My personal favorite was their insurance programs on new products. You could take out an insurance product on a new product that you wanted to launch that you had yet to design, and then 48 hours later, you could cash in that insurance policy because the product failed. Beautiful. And now we've got shadow financing, which is everything from illegal hedge funds to loan sharks. You guys remember the Obama stimulus package, right? $800 billion, 3% of GDP, spread over 2 years. There was a lot of concern among American economists that the United States could not metabolize that much money that quickly without fraud and corruption. True, we had a big problem there. This is now, in relative terms, the equivalent of an Obama stimulus package every 17 days. Will you get growth if you do it this way? Sure. What can't you do with a bottomless supply of 0% loans? But it's not sustainable. It's not profitable. And if anything happens to the punch bowl, the whole thing collapses. Every single economic sector in China is worse than subprime. And the worst one of all could bring the whole thing crashing down. There's 3 types of economic growth in the world. You have consumption-led, that's the United States and Mexico. That is not represented by any of the colors on this map. They don't have a single part of the country that is consumption-led growth. Second, you have export-led growth. That's South Korea, that's Germany, that's the blue. And then third, you have investment-led growth. That's all those cheap loans. On this map, the green is where the investment is number 1. The orange is where investment is more than everything else put together. The red is where investment is more than everything put together doubled. Guess where the Chinese grow their food? Agriculture is the most exposed to this broken financial model. So when it does break, and every other country in the world that has tried it has suffered a massive depression at some point, not only does every economic sector in China break at the same time, but they have famine. And the timing couldn't be worse. 25 years after the one-child policy, the Chinese are running out of 25-year-olds. The Chinese are not nearly as good at math as they would have us believe. Now, you may have heard about a year and a half ago, the Chinese shifted from a one-child policy to a two-child policy to address this. Riddle me this. How long does it take to raise a 25-year-old? Those of you who are parents, don't help those who are not. My mother assures me that it's 47 years and she's almost done. But the Chinese don't have that kind of time. And they also have a massive strategic threat. Get to your question here. This purple dotted line, that is the path for most oil shipments from the Persian Gulf to Northeast Asia. This dotted line, especially in this section here, can be interrupted by almost any weapon system that the Chinese or the Japanese maintain. Very vulnerable. But this line, the deep sea route, is beyond the range of all Chinese weapon systems, but not Japanese weapon systems. The Chinese don't have a long-reach army, or not a long-reach navy. The Japanese do. So when the shooting starts, the convoy routes go out. Japan can run them and control them. The Chinese cannot. In addition, you've got this line of islands, it's called the first island chain, that box the Chinese in. So for them to just break out of that, not only would they have to float a navy that's almost as powerful as the American Navy, which would be about 20 times as powerful as their navy is currently. They'd have to get by all the Japanese ships, all the Japanese cruise missiles. They'd have to seize control of one of these archipelagos and then hold it so they could funnel their merchant traffic in and out. And if you're going to do that, does anyone really want to buy their crap? They're in a box, and they know it. And so does Japan. And so the Japanese get it. Shinzo Abe was the second world leader to come to Washington in the aftermath of the Trump election to seek a specific bilateral deal. He understands the new transactional nature of American foreign policy. He understands it so well that he showed up with a bribe, $500 billion from the Japanese state to invest in American infrastructure and industrial plant. He doesn't need the Americans to participate in the conflict. It'd be nice, but he doesn't need it. He just needs to make sure that the United States is neutral. Will $500 billion be enough? Don't know. Good start, though. Back in China, things are getting dire. This is foreign direct investment. The orange bars, that's FDI from the United States to China. In the early days, it's where you would expect it. But when you get to recent years, it's more or less equalized. It equalized until last year.
What?
This is not the culmination of a century-long plan by Beijing to dominate the United States and force American children to learn Mandarin. This is Chinese businessmen getting their money, the kofefe, out of town before the whole thing breaks down. This is capital flight. Because they see what's coming. the anti-corruption campaign that has been racking China for the last 3 years is not about making China a law-abiding place. Although if it achieves that, they're not going to complain. It's about publicly executing enough politicians whose people recognize on live television, there have been about 100 so far, so that the rank and file, the average citizen, looks up at the television and says, you know what, it doesn't matter if I have a job or if I can feed my family. I'm Han Chinese, President Xi is my leader, and that's enough. Anywhere else, more volume, anywhere else at any other time, we would call this a cult of personality. President Xi has already consolidated more power unto his person than any Chinese leader in history, with the sole exception of Mao. And he's about to pass Mao. Because next month, the Communist Party leadership meets at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, where Xi is supposed to nominate his successor. Odds are he is going to nominate his heretofore unheard of identical twin brother. He does not believe that the Chinese system can handle a leadership transition, and he's probably right. So he is preparing to close ranks. And so Xi was the 6th world leader to come to Washington to seek a bilateral deal. 2 things came from this. First, Xi was very clear that he did not want to meet in Washington. He did not want to be there where the press corps would exist, where the diplomatic corps would be, because he wanted to be able to talk to Trump without it getting out. And so they held it at Mar-a-Lago, where Trump could control the atmosphere. Because second, what he said was, you hold all the cards. Our economy is in your hands. If you pull back from the world, that will throw us into at best a tailspin. So let's talk. Let's talk about North Korea and the South China Sea and cybercrime and trade. Now, whether or not you believe Xi, whether or not you think Trump was smart or dumb for listening, Xi was persuasive enough that Trump didn't lower the boom right there and there. And what progress we've seen in trade in the last 6 months, which is more than the United States has seen with the Chinese in the last 12 years, I might add, is largely because of this meeting. Will it be enough? Will it be sustainable? Those are good questions. I don't know. But it's very clear between these 2 men who's in the driver's seat in the relationship. On a slightly less cheery topic, you've got Europe. The Northern European Plain, that's where the money is. That's the 2nd densest section of navigable waterways in the world. Water transport is 1/15 the cost of land transport. This has been an economic core of the human condition throughout history because of it. France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Poland, that is the economic core of the continent. However, the rivers are not interconnected into a single system. They transect the plain. So there are French rivers and Dutch rivers and German rivers and Polish rivers. Identity clings to the rivers, and so does the desire for autonomy. So it's a path, it's a highway for trade, but it's also a highway for competition and war. And that's the good part of Europe. You get out of the Northern European Plain, you get into arid zones and mountains and peninsulas and islands, areas that are much more difficult to develop. And the Europeans decided, for political reasons, to merge all of this into a single currency zone. Unfortunately, if you run a business in Italy, where development is hard, you're now on a level playing field with someone in Northern Germany, and you cannot possibly compete. The 15 years that the Eurozone has been in existence, all it has done is picked up the industrial base and the employment capacity of the South, 50 years of effort, and transferred it north, leaving only debts behind. With every day that passes, the South falls further behind. The only way that this could possibly work is in an environment where the external security guarantor comes in and changes the rules of the game. That's Bretton Woods. The country that matters the most are the men in the middle, the Germans. 4 navigable waterways and a dense footprint, it is the densest capital accumulation zone in the world. They've got a problem though. They're smack in the middle of the Northern European Plain. There are 8 significant powers hard up on their borders. It is the most difficult geopolitical environment on Earth. And so the only way that the Germans know that they can possibly survive in this environment is to be better. better financing, better infrastructure, better education, stronger industrial base. But you take anything as big as Germany and you make it as efficient as Germany, and by default it is a threat to all of its neighbors. So European history is a pendulum that swings between periods of extreme German strength where they nearly overwhelm everyone, but that triggers a coalition that tears the Germans down and makes it into a black hole that sucks everybody in. The only way that Germany can survive as a modern, peaceful power is if an external security guarantor comes in and changes the rules of the game and guarantees everybody's security. That's the United States. That's NATO. And that is now over. And so Angela Merkel was the 5th world leader to come to Washington to seek a bilateral deal. And she said, Donald, do you realize that if you do what you say you're going to do, that is not simply the end of NATO and the European Union, that is the end of Germany. And his response summed up was, uh-huh. See, Merkel did not understand the transactional nature of the new relationship. She came just asking for stuff. She didn't bring anything in exchange. And so on her way out the door, Trump gave her a parting gift. A bill for services rendered for defending Germany for the last 70 years. The German-American relationship, for all intents and purposes, is already over, as is the NATO relationship. And that couldn't happen at a worse time either. This is the demography of Italy. That, in one graphic, is why the European financial crisis will end in catastrophe. Consumption-led growth in the periphery is now flat out impossible. There aren't enough young people. You cannot get 40-somethings and 50-somethings to kick out kids like they're teenagers, not even in Italy. I just totally messed up that joke, didn't I? Not even in Italy. There we go. This is Germany, even worse. Now, you guys have heard of what's going on with Deutsche Bank recently? Now, one of Europe's most powerful financial institutions is on the rocks. This is why. Think about how banks make their money. It's about the spread between the cost of their funds and the cost of their loans. 0% interest rates have collapsed the spread, and the lack of people in their 20s and 30s have collapsed the number of loans. Less money per loan, fewer loans, that's how banks die. The fun part is, I don't think that Deutsche Bank is a harbinger of what to come. I think Deutsche Bank is the best case outcome. Because the Germans, accounting, that's kind of their thing. Italy, not so much. If you look at the non-performing loan stack, here's the United States, about 2%. 5% is the point where the FDIC comes in and closes down your institution. Here's Italy. All the yellow are the other Eurozone countries. Here's the best part. In the United States, we define a non-performing loan as when you are 91 days late on a payment. That's when you go into foreclosure. In Italy, if you're 271 days late, but you've made a partial payment, you're still in good standing. That uses this definition. In relative terms, Italy's bad loan stack is about 80 times the size of the Americans at the height of the subprime crisis. We have already had 4 major Italian banks crash this year. I don't know if this is the beginning of the end, but it looks eerily like it. And so Theresa May was the first world leader to come. She's leading the country into Brexit. And in her meeting with Donald, she laid out that, look, we're going to be on our own again, which means that we need to double our intelligence budget and our diplomatic budget, because we can't rely on European institutions. We've got to forge our own path. We would like to share every scrap of information that we get from those expansions with you. In addition, in the next 5 years, we're going to be floating 2 super carriers, the only 2 super carriers that will not be flying an American flag. We would like to fully integrate our super carriers into your naval battle groups. And Trump is like, oh, well, this is fantastic. This is huge. What can we offer you? She said, we would love a free trade deal. Done. They started negotiations that day. Brits have gone out and done this with India, New Zealand, Australia, Turkey, and Canada as well. Here's the problem. This is illegal under European Union law. The European Commission, that's their executive, has full and sole authority to negotiate trade deals on behalf of its member states, even if you're on the way out the door. So all the talk in Brussels these days isn't just about how to punish the Brits for leaving, but to punish them for having the audacity to plan for the day after. And I'm like, really? It's like, don't you have a few other things on your plate right now? You have a demographic crisis, a consumption crisis, a trade crisis, a financial crisis, a banking crisis, a Libya crisis, a Russia crisis, a Turkey crisis, and you're drowning in amber waves of refugees. This is not what I would call an institution that is flexible, because all they're doing is about bitching about Britain while the whole ship sinks. Without NATO, without the United States, without Britain, the European Union is in its final days. Going back to the United States, there's a few faces that you should learn. This is Peter Navarro. He is in charge of the recently formed National Trade Council. Its sole reason to exist is to identify and prosecute trade wars. 3 guesses what his target number 1 is. Now, Navarro is not a policymaker. He is an academic. He's from UC Davis, which should tell you everything you need to know about him. Oh, wow. Usually that only works in California. So I appreciate that. And so he has a reputation of when reality clashes with his academic theories, he assumes that there's something wrong with reality, just kind of boldly goes. His partner in this venture is Robert Lighthizer. He's the new U.S. trade representative. The USTR is responsible for negotiating and enforcing trade pacts. Now, Lighthizer has been in government before in the 1980s. Now, have you guys heard of the Plaza Accords? This was him. Now, back in the early 1980s, the first Reagan term, the Cold War was running pretty hot, and the United States had to make sure that the Allies stayed on board. So it kind of took a step back and let the Allies manipulate their economies in order to keep them loyal. And so a lot of them depressed their currencies artificially in order to boost their exports. Not that anyone here would ever do that. And in exchange, the United States was able to run its security policy how it wanted. But by 1985, we had the starting of the thaw, glasnost and perestroika were just getting started, and Reagan decided, okay, enough is enough. He drew the Allies together at the Plaza Hotel in New York and just laid out an ultimatum. You're going to stop this, and if you don't, we're out of Bretton Woods, and you're on your own. We'll cut a separate deal with everybody else. Within 6 months, not only had the currency intervention stopped, it had reversed, and the US dollar fell by 50%. Lighthizer was the Reagan administration's hatchet man to Tokyo to make sure that they did not renege on the deal. And he played such hardball and forced such concessions that he triggered the 1989 property crash in Tokyo, which has haunted the Japanese ever since. They've had 7 recessions since 1989. He's the primary cause. His target, number 1, is also China. And he's the guy in charge of the NAFTA renegotiation. Now, his goal is to not scrap the deal. His goal is NAFTA 2.0. But the United States holds the cards in this negotiation, and it's going to be rough for everybody involved. Just keep in mind that his goal is to not scrap it. His goal is to update it. National Security Council Chairman. This is General McMaster. Defense Secretary, General Mattis. Smart dudes, they know their stuff, but here's the problem. They're not involved in the trade talks. Remember, for the Americans, trade is a plank of security policy. It is not something you go after for its own purposes. It's always been about security, and these guys aren't even in the room for the conversations. So you know that American involvement with the world economically is, for all intents and purposes, already over. The decision has already been made. And our final general, General Kelly, is the new chief of staff. We had a problem in the Trump administration where anyone could just kind of waltz into the West Wing and drop something on the president's desk that they knew would get a rise out of him, and he'd go off and launch a Twitter storm. Kelly put an end to that. He fired about 1/3 of the staff, Most of the free traders that remained left on their own accord, and then he locked the door to the president's office. Fred is now shut off, and there's no one on his staff anymore who speaks for free trade, and no one else can get in. So he's left with his Twitter account, assuming that Kelly doesn't take his phone away that day, which apparently has happened like 3 times already. But there is no voice in the administration arguing for trade, with the exception of Lighthizer and Navarro. So what do the Americans do? I mean, they still have the military. They're not going to downsize it. They're just going to deploy it differently. There is a period in history that we get a little bit of enlightenment from. Back at the turn of the last century, we had Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, who were leading the country in the aftermath of the Civil War Reconstruction. Both of the parties had broken down. The United States didn't have a broad strategic policy. It was focused on internal issues. We had turned populist. And that left it not to America to have a foreign policy, but for Americans to decide what was going to happen. And American businessmen of all stripes left the United States into the wider world to seek their own fortunes. And when they reached a country, they would interface with it, and American political and military power would follow. It was a corporatist foreign policy. It generated a lot of bad blood, particularly in Mexico, and that's where we're going to be for the next 15 to 20 years. The blue and the green maps, the blue and the green states, those are the ones that have a strong demography, relatively reliable energy sources. The difference between the two is the blue have relatively calm security concerns, and the greens are a little bit dicey. Everything within the hash lines, those are zones that the United States is probably going to maintain its primacy via dollar diplomacy. It's a very different way of working with the United States. It's a lot more hostile, it's a lot more confrontational. The only way you can avoid it is if you can get a bilateral deal with Washington now, before corporate America realizes that this is their only option. It's Donald Trump or bust. No pressure. The real problem is that this is how the Americans see themselves. This is a picture of the pioneer era. Go out west for the price of a small Korean import car, load up the family into a Conestoga wagon, take them out, break ground. Within 6 months, you are growing grain and exporting it to the global market for hard currency. It's been the greatest period of economic and political expansion in human history, and for the United States, it lasted for 150 years. This is the source of the American can-do attitude. This is why we're so arrogantly optimistic all the time. I know it's just painful to listen to sometimes, but that's where it comes from. But as we all know, this isn't how the world works every day. Sometimes you lose, sometimes there's a setback. But Americans can't process that. They don't have a context of failure. And so when something goes wrong, they're convinced that the end is near, that the covenant with God has been broken, and they absolutely lose their minds. As a culture, Americans are manic depressive. Everything is perfect, we're in a perfect world until we're not, and then the end is nigh. And if you look at some of the big historical moments in American history, you can see how that defines not just American reactions, but the global structure. Sputnik, let's be honest, beeping aluminum grapefruit. Not a big deal. The Americans were ahead in rocketry, electronics, and metallurgy. They just hadn't lobbed something up because they wanted to make sure it stayed up there. So Sputnik fell out of the sky 20 years later, and we had a national heart attack. We completely refabricated our industrial and commercial and educational systems because we had lost the Cold War. And if we didn't change everything, we were dead. And we coasted on those advances for the next 40 years. Vietnam, another great example. The Americans lost a post-colonial war to a rice producer. It wasn't our colony, and we were the world's largest rice exporter at the time. But because of our panic attack post-Vietnam, we refabricated the way we work our military. Instead of sending in scads of drafted infantry, we stepped back. We married information technology to military technology, came up with smart bombs, cruise missiles, satellite communications, cell phones. That's what powered the internet revolution. The last one was 9/11, tragedy by any measure, 3,000 dead. As a side effect of our reaction to 9/11, The United States now has the sharp end of American power on every side of every trade and oil artery on the planet. It's now been 16 years since we were last scared. We're due. And this time, we're not concerned with the global order. Whoever is dumb enough to poke the United States next is going to regret it for a very long time. Let's talk about what makes things work. The tan area, that's the greater Midwest. That's the largest chunk of arable land in the world, bigger than the next two put together. And as important as that is, it's the blue lines on the map that make all the difference. Moving things from A to B is a bit of a bitch, but if you can float it, it's cheap, easy, and hopefully safe. The United States has more miles of navigable waterway in the greater Midwest by itself than the rest of the planet put together. In addition, deserts and mountains to the south, oceans on either side, forests and lakes to the north. The United States has the richest chunk of territory in the world and the most physically securable. Decades of bipartisan effort have yet to mess this up, and we're not going to mess it up in the next 5 years. Mexico's different. In the south, it's the tropics. In the north, it's the desert. It's too hot to live on the coast. So most Mexicans live on the central plateau, about a mile above sea level, where it lifts you out of the disease belt and lifts you out of the desert. It's the only way to make it work, which means that Mexico is living in a series of mountain valleys. Each mountain valley has its own political leadership and its own economic leadership, the descendants of the conquistadors. This makes for a very different political and economic culture. Development is difficult. You can't achieve economies of scale. If it wasn't for the fact that Mexico was in North America, it would be a failed state. But because it's directly adjacent to the richest chunk of territory on the land, or the richest chunk of territory in the world, Mexico has a wondrous opportunity to leapfrog up the development scale whenever bilateral relations are suitably friendly to allow for trade. The question is preserving that relationship. Because if you take a step back and ignore the politics, the stars are coming into alignment for Mexico. And Mexico is going to be one of the 3 fastest growing economies for the next 50 years. First big factor, shale. Not Mexico's, the United States's. One of the fun things about the shale fields is there's a lot of waste natural gas, and it's available for anybody who wants to use it. Mexico has been very aggressive in building new pipelines to take that natural gas into the Mexican interior. So the red lines are the pipelines that existed back in 2005. Everything else is a new pipeline that comes online by the end of next year. This has allowed Mexico to already increase their import of American natural gas by a factor of 4, and it will triple again in the next 3 years. Brownouts, blackouts are going to be a thing of the past in Mexico. Second, the competition. These are monthly labor costs in Southeast Asian countries, which are countries I think are going to do fairly well in the new order. Here's Mexico right in the middle, very competitive. Here's China. That's the one-child policy at work. There's been a 10-fold increase in labor costs in the last 15 years. Mexican labor is now not only more highly skilled, it's half the price. And we've seen 4 million jobs reshore from East Asia to Mexico since 2007. Third, NAFTA and Brexit. Let's start with Brexit. This fabulous head of hair here, Justin Trudeau, had this clever idea. If the Brits are leaving and they want to get a free trade deal with the United States and they want to get a free trade deal with Canada, why not just bring them into NAFTA? It's an interesting idea. You'd have the second largest chunk of capital processing in the world all of a sudden in the world's largest remaining free trade zone. If that were to happen, it would be good for Canada, it would be good for the United States, but it would be phenomenal for Mexico. You see, in Europe, very few countries have gone with a multi-state supply chain system. They keep it all at home for political purpose. They're very nationalist. And so if you bring Britain into NAFTA, for the first time, their economy would be exposed to a country at a different stage of the wage structure. And you get British industry coming down here to set up operations. And because Britain is a primary location for capital flight out of Europe, all that money could be transferred here to build industrial plants. It could be phenomenal for both sides. As for NAFTA, if the European system goes away, if the global free trade order goes away, you have to have a separate deal with Washington. Mexico already has one. The trick is to make sure it stays in place. Now, in the worst case scenario, NAFTA goes away. There's a recession in Mexico, there's a really harsh recession in Texas. The peso plunges. And all of a sudden, the justification for investment in Mexico increases. Because if you increase that wage differential, trade will happen one way or another. Doesn't matter what the tariff happens to be. It'll just push down wages in Mexico, widen the differential, and increase the strength of the argument for trade. It's not the best way to do it, certainly, but it's not the end of the world. And finally, demographics. Most of the developing world is aging faster than the developed world. So the average American, for example, will be younger than the average Brazilian by 2040. That's a problem here too, but the birth bust in Mexico started 30 years after everybody else's. So this